They left my brother Cal for dead in a dry wash north of the Clearwater, and the men who did it were the same color and creed and church as the men who'd shake his hand in town the next Sunday. I want that said plain at the start, because I have heard this story told wrong for 40 years, told as if a savage band found a white man and ought to be thanked for not finishing him. It was the other way around. His own kind put 3 bullets near him and rode off whistling. The people we'd been taught to bolt our doors against carried him 11 miles on a travois and kept him breathing through 2 nights when any sensible person would have let the cold have him. I was 14 that autumn, and I have spent the years since trying to be worthy of what I watched. I was not Cal's son by blood. My folks went into the ground the winter I was 9, the same fever that took his wife and his boy, and when the county had no place for me, Cal Dunmore put me on a horse behind him without a word, and that was the end of the matter. He was not a warm man. I want to be honest about him. He'd been warm once. I'm told he laughed easy before, but by the time I knew him his face had set hard as a creek bed in August, and he ran the 2 rivers with his jaw shut and his eyes down. He grieved the way a stone grieves. You couldn't see it move. You only knew it was heavy. The Sweetgrass Valley in those days was a long green bowl where the Clearwater came down off the high country and met Painted Creek, and the grass grew belly-deep to a horse, and a man could believe for whole afternoons that the world was a gentle place. It was not, but it looked it, and the looking was worth something. The trouble came the way trouble usually does, wearing a good coat and carrying papers. A man named Augustus Verrill had bought up the old Halloran holdings at the mouth of the valley and hung out a shingle that read Verrill Land and Cattle Co. in gold paint, and within a season he had decided that the whole bowl of the Sweetgrass belonged, by rights and by documents he kept in a brass-cornered box, to him. The documents were forged. We didn't know that yet. We only knew that the homesteaders down in the bottom started getting letters, and then visits, and then one cold morning the Pell family's barn was a black ring of ash, and the Pells were on the road to nowhere with what they could carry. Cal had no quarrel with Verrill at first. He kept to his own grass, paid his own way, and figured a man's troubles were a man's troubles. That was his code, and it had kept him upright through worse than Verrill. But the company's claim ran a line straight through the 2 rivers' best water, and one October afternoon 2 of Verrill's riders came up the lane to tell Cal his deed was in question, and he'd best be reasonable. "I've held this ground 9 years," Cal said. "My wife's buried on that knoll. I'll be a great many things before I'm reasonable about that." I was forking hay in the yard. I remember the way the riders looked at each other. I remember thinking, in the dumb way a boy thinks, that nothing would come of it because nothing ever had. 3 days later Cal rode north to look at a stretch of fence the company men claimed crossed their line, and he didn't come home. We searched 2 days. I rode till my horse near foundered. On the 3rd morning a rider I didn't know came down out of the foothills leading Cal's gelding by a rope, and on the gelding's back, lashed there so he wouldn't fall, was my brother gray as ash, wrapped in a buffalo robe that wasn't ours, alive by a thread I could not account for. The rider was a young man with a face I'd been raised to fear, and he would not come past the gate. He said in careful English that the man was hurt bad, that a woman of his people had pulled the lead out of him and stopped the bleeding, that the fever was on him now and would decide the rest. He said his people had carried him as far as they judged safe. Then he looked at me, a scared white boy with a pitchfork, and something in his face was not unkind. He said, "She says he will want to die before he wants to live. Do not let him talk you into it." And he turned his horse and was gone before I could find a word. That was the first I heard of Saya, though I didn't have her name yet. I had only her work, which was my brother's heartbeat, going on against all reason in his chest. The town doctor at Saddle Notch was a drunk who set bones like he was angry at them, and he looked at Cal's wound clean, packed with something green that smelled of crushed leaves, already knitting at the edges, and he scowled and said whoever done it knew more than he did, and he wouldn't touch it for fear of undoing good work. So I nursed my brother myself, 14 years old, spooning broth past his teeth and changing the dressing the way I'd watched the doctor not dare to. And on the 9th night, the fever broke and Cal opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling of his own house like he'd been cheated. "Why'd you bring me back?" he said. Not a question, an accusation. "I didn't," I said. "They did." He turned his head. "Who's they?" I told him what I knew, which was little. A band wintering up in the sweetgrass bottoms, the Smoke Hill people, the writer had called them, when I'd finally thought to ask his name and gotten the band's instead. A woman who dug the company's bullets out of him with a knife in her own 2 hands. Cal listened with his eyes shut. When I was done, he was quiet a long while, and then he said the thing that started everything, though neither of us knew it. He said, "Then I owe them." I have known men who could say a thing like that and mean it only as far as the next sunrise. Cal was not one of them. A debt to Cal Dunmore was a fence post sunk in concrete. It did not lean and it did not come out. He was 3 weeks healing before he could sit a horse, and the first ride he made, gray-faced, gritting his teeth at every jolt, was up into the bottoms to find the people who'd kept him alive, so he could thank them and square the account and get back to grieving in peace. It did not go the way he planned. Almost nothing in this story did. The Smoke Hill camp sat in a fold of the hills where Painted Creek ran clear and cottonwoods broke the wind, and when Cal and I rode in, we found a people braced for trouble. Men stood and watched us come. Children were called inside. We were 2 armed strangers of the kind that had been making their lives smaller every year, and the only reason we weren't turned back at the edge of the camp was a woman who came out from among the lodges and stood in our path with her chin up and her hands loose at her sides, looking at Cal the way a wheelwright looks at a wheel she's already fixed once. "You should be in your bed," she said. Her English was better than mine. "You have torn it open twice already. I can see it on your shirt." Cal got down off his horse slow, holding his side. "You'd be the one," he said. "I would be the one." She did not soften. "You came all this way to bleed on my grass. Why?" "To thank you," Cal said, "and to know what I owe." And Saya, for that was her name, I learned it that afternoon, looked at my hard, gray, stubborn brother for a long moment, and then she laughed. It was a short laugh, not cruel, more tired than anything. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I did not pull the iron out of you for you. I pulled it out of you because my grandmother taught me that a life left to die in the dirt is a sickness in the one who walks past it. You were the dirt's that day. Now you are not. The debt is between you and the dirt. Go home." I thought that would be the end of it. I have learned since that the things you're sure are endings are usually the place a story sets its feet. Because Cal did not go home and forget. He went home and could not stop turning it over. A people he'd been taught to fear had done the one thing his own neighbors hadn't. They'd seen him in the dirt and not walked past. And those same neighbors, or men who looked just like them, were the ones who'd put him there. The world Cal had arranged in his head, the one where his kind were the steady center and everyone else the danger at the edges, had come apart in a dry wash north of the Clearwater, and he was not a man who could glue a broken thing back into a shape he knew was false. So he started watching, and what he watched was the company. It was a hard winter, that one, the kind that comes early and means it. And it was in the teeth of it that the Verrill Land and Cattle Co. made its move on the sweetgrass bottoms, which is to say, on the very ground the Smoke Hill people had wintered for longer than there'd been a saddle notch to put on a map. Verrill's brass-cornered box held a paper that said the bottoms were railroad grant land, sold fair to the company, and that the band camped there were trespassers to be removed. He brought the paper to the band's council with 6 armed men at his back and an Indian agent in his pocket, and he gave them till the spring thaw to clear out. I know all this because Cal told me, and Cal knew it because by then Cal was riding up to the Smoke Hill camp near every week, on one pretext or another, and getting turned back near every time and coming home grimmer each ride. "They don't want me there," I said to him once. We were mending tack by the stove. "No," he said, "they don't." Then why do you keep going? He worked the awl through the leather and didn't look up. Because somebody's about to do to them what was done to the Pells, he said. And I've decided I'd rather be a man who got told to go home 100 times than a man who didn't go at all. It was the most words I'd heard him string together since the fever, and there was something new under them, not warmth yet, but the place where warmth lives when the ground's too hard for it to come up. Saya was the one who dug the company's iron out of my brother, and Saya was the one, it turned out, who saw before anyone what Verrill's paper truly was. She had been to the mission school as a girl, 3 hard years of it, and she had come away with 2 things her teachers had not meant to give her. An English she could read better than half the men in Saddle Notch, and a cold, clear understanding of how her people were being stolen from with ink instead of bullets. When Verrill laid his railroad grant paper before the council, the men argued about whether to fight or to move, the 2 arguments that grief always offers and that both end the same way. Saya did not argue. She asked to see the paper. She read it 3 times. And then she said, in front of the whole council, that the paper was a lie, that the survey lines it cited ran wrong, that the grant number was for country 2 valleys east, that whoever drew it up had counted on no one among the people being able to read it close. They believed her, because she had never given them cause not to. But believing a paper is a lie and proving it before a court that did not want to hear you were 2 different mountains, and the second one had no trail up it that anyone could see. That was where Cal came in, though it took a near disaster to put him there. It happened in the bad week before Christmas, when the snow came down for 3 days and the company, impatient, decided not to wait for the thaw after all. Dunk Sether, that was the name of Verrill's foreman, a long gray killer of a man who'd ridden for worse outfits than this one, took 5 riders up into the bottoms in the storm to encourage the band to start moving early. They didn't burn anything. They didn't have to. They drove off a third of the band's horse herd into the blizzard, knowing that a people set afoot in winter would either freeze, starve, or leave. It was a quiet kind of murder, the kind the law never has a word for. Cal heard about it the next morning from the young man who'd brought him home, Tully, the band called him, a cousin of Saya's, half her steel and twice her temper, who'd come down out of the storm at a dead run to the one white man he half trusted, because there was nowhere else to go and the horses were dying in the drifts. Cal didn't ask a question. He put me and 3 of our hands on horses, threw open the 2 rivers' winter pens, and we rode into the worst weather I'd ever been out in to find a native band's scattered ponies and drive them home to a people who, by every rule we'd been raised on, were supposed to be our enemies. We found 19 head. 11 had already frozen. We pushed the living ones back up into the bottoms through snow to the horses' hocks, and when we came into the camp half dead ourselves, leading another people's wealth back to them out of the storm, I saw the thing I'd been waiting all autumn to see, though I hadn't known it. I saw Saya look at Cal differently. Not soft, not yet, but the way you look at a tool you'd written off and just watched do honest work. She came out into the snow with a robe and put it over his shoulders herself, the man she'd told to go home 12 times, and she said, "You will tear your side open again." And Cal said, "It's torn," and she said, "Then come inside before you bleed to death and make my trouble worse." And that, I have always believed, is the moment the 2 of them started, though it would be a long way yet from a robe in the snow to anything either of them would call by a tender name. Inside her grandmother's lodge, by the fire, the steel finally bent enough to talk. Saya laid it out for him plain, because she decided he was a man who could be useful, and she was not one to waste a tool out of pride. The company's paper was forged. She could read the survey lines and prove they were false, but a court would not take the word of a woman of the Smoke Hill people against the word of Augustus Verrill and his hired agent. What a court might take, she said, was the word of a white rancher of 9 years standing who could read a brand and a bill of sale, who knew the land office men by their first names, and who could stand up in Saddle Notch and say the survey was a fraud and not be laughed out of the room. "You want to use me," Cal said. "Yes," Saya said, no apology in it. "And you want to pay a debt you have decided you owe, so we will use each other. That is how it works between people who do not trust each other but need the same thing." She looked at him level across the fire. "Do not pretend it is friendship. Friendship is earned slower than this and costs more." Cal almost smiled. I saw it almost happen, the first near smile I'd seen on him since the fever, and it surprised him more than it surprised me. "All right," he said, "we'll use each other." That's how the alliance began, not with warmth, but with a cold, honest bargain between two stubborn people who'd each decided the other was the only road to the thing they couldn't reach alone. I have come to think that's the strongest way a thing can start. Warmth that comes first is cheap. Warmth that has to climb up out of suspicion, hand over hand, that's the kind that holds. The work was slow and dangerous, and it took the rest of that winter. Cal rode to the land office at the county seat under the excuse of his own deed troubles and came back with the real survey records. And Saya, by the fire in the lodge that became the place we all met, laid the company's paper beside them and showed where the lines had been changed, where a number had been lifted from a grant 2 valleys east and dropped onto the sweetgrass like a brand burned over an old one. It was good forgery. It would have held against anyone who couldn't read it close. But Saya read everything close, and Cal knew exactly which official in the territory's land bureau could be made to care, and between the two of them, her knowing what was true and him knowing who had to be told, they built a case the way you build a stone wall, one fitted piece at a time. What I remember most from that winter is not the papers. It's the way two people who'd sworn it wasn't friendship kept catching themselves at it. There was the day Saya came down to the 2 rivers, she came to us now, as often as Cal went up, and found a colt in our corral that no man on the place could gentle, a leggy flea-bitten thing that struck and bit, and had already broken a hand's wrist. Cal had half a mind to sell it for what it'd bring. Saya climbed the rail without a word and dropped into the pen, and we all hollered, and she ignored us. And she stood very still in the middle of that pen for the better part of an hour, doing nothing, letting the colt circle and blow and threaten, until the threatening ran out of it and it didn't know what to do with a person who'd offered it no fight. By dark it was eating from her palm. Cal stood at the rail the whole time and didn't say one word, and on his face was a look I had not seen there in 5 years, and I was young but I was not stupid. And I understood that my brother was watching a woman gentle a wild thing by refusing to be its enemy, and that he knew exactly what the colt felt like. There was the night her grandmother fell sick, and Cal, who would not in the old days have crossed the street for a stranger, rode through sleet to Saddle Notch and bullied the drunk doctor onto a horse at the end of a winter night. And when the doctor balked at riding up to an Indian camp, Cal said something low I didn't hear, and the doctor went. The old woman lived. She lived 11 more years, in fact, long enough to be at the wedding I'll come to. And I have always believed she decided that night that Cal Dunmore would do. And there was the long argument, for they argued those two. They were neither of them built for easy agreement, about what Cal owed and what Saya owed and whether either of them owed the other anything at all. It went on the whole winter in pieces. He'd say he was paying a life debt. She'd say a life debt couldn't be paid because it wasn't a coin, it was a thing that had happened, and the only honest answer to a life saved was a life lived better. He'd chew on that for a week. She'd say he hadn't lived better, he'd just gotten busier, which wasn't the same. He'd chew on that for a month. I think now that what they were really arguing about, the whole time, was whether two people from opposite sides of a line the whole world had drawn could be anything to each other but a bargain, and that neither of them dared say so, so they fought about debts instead. The company didn't sleep while we worked. Verrill knew Cal was riding up to the camp, knew the land office had been asking questions, and a man like that does not lose ground without reaching for the iron. In February, they came for Cal direct. Sether and 3 men waited for him on the Clearwater Road at dusk. the same kind of ambush that had near killed him in the fall, and this time they meant to finish it. But Saya had sent Tully to ride with Cal that week. She would not say why, only that she'd had a feeling, and her feelings were not the kind a wise man bet against. And Tully saw the riders sitting their horses in the willows before Cal did, and the two of them went off the road into the brush and lost the company men in the dark. And Cal came home white and shaking, not with fear, with a fury I'd never seen in him. "They left me for dead once and I let it be," he said, low in the kitchen, his hands flat on the table to stop them moving. "I told myself it was a man's own trouble. It is not. They are killing people slow all up and down this valley and dressing it in paper, and I am done deciding it isn't mine." It was the first time I understood that Cal had crossed a line of his own and burned the bridge behind him. Whatever he'd been raised to believe about who belonged in the sweetgrass and who didn't, he'd left it in that dry wash with his own blood. He was the band's man now, and there'd be no quiet way back to being only a rancher who minded his grass. Saya understood it too when I told her, for I was the message between the camp and the ranch by then, riding back and forth so often my horse could have made the trip asleep. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, not to me exactly, more to the fire, "He has made enemies of his own people for hours. That is not nothing. That is the most a person can do." And there was something in her voice that was not the voice of a woman talking about a bargain. I want to be careful here, because this is the part people get wrong, and I have spent 40 years setting it right. There came a night, early spring, the thaw close, the company's deadline near. When Cal and Saya were the last two awake by the fire, the case as built as they could build it, the dangerous work of carrying it to the marshal still ahead. And I was rolled in a robe pretending to sleep across the lodge, the way a boy does, and I heard them talk in the low voices people use when they think the world is asleep. She said she had decided something. She said she had been telling herself all winter that he was a tool and the bond between them was a bargain, because that was a thing she could hold, and a woman of her people had learned to be careful what she let herself hold, because the world had a way of taking it. She said she did not believe it anymore. She said she had watched him ride into a blizzard for horses that weren't his and bully a doctor up a hill in the sleet and make enemies of his own kind for hers, and that a tool did not do those things, and a bargain did not feel the way this had come to feel, and she was too honest a woman to keep calling a fire a candle. And Cal, my hard, gray, buried brother, was quiet so long I thought he'd say nothing at all, which would have been like him. Then he said that he'd buried his wife and his boy on a knoll above the Clearwater, and told himself the warm part of him was in the ground with them, that he was a stone now and stones don't want things. He said he'd believed it right up until a woman he'd been raised to fear pulled the iron out of him and told him to go home, and he'd found that he could not go home, not the old home, not the one where his heart was supposed to stay shut. He said he didn't have pretty words. He'd never had them, and what he'd had he'd lost in a fever 5 years back. But he said that if she would have a stone that had learned, late and slow, that it wasn't done wanting things after all, then he was that stone, and it was hers, and he'd spend whatever years he had left standing where she stood. Nobody touched anybody. I want that understood. This was two grown people, careful and grieved and old enough to know what a word costs, choosing each other with words across a fire and nothing more, and it was the most that has ever happened in any room I've been in. Saya said yes. She said it in her own tongue first, and then in mine, so there'd be no mistaking it. And I lay there in my robe with my heart going like a colt's, and understood that I had just heard the thing the whole winter had been climbing toward. But choosing each other and surviving to live it were two more separate mountains, and the company was waiting at the foot of the second. We carried the case to the marshal at the county seat in the last week before the thaw, Cal and Saya and Tully and me. 4 days' ride through breaking weather, the real survey records and the forged paper and Saya's account all bundled in oilcloth against the wet. Marshal Hewitt was an old man with a fair reputation and a tired face, and he did not want the trouble. You could see him not wanting it from across the room. But Cal Dunmore was a known man of 9 years standing, and he stood in front of Hewitt's desk and laid the two papers side by side and read the fall survey lines off the company's grant the way Saya had taught him, number by number, until even a man who didn't want to see it could not unsee it. And when Hewitt's eyes went to Saya, the woman he'd been ready to discount, Cal said, "She found it. She read what no white man in this territory bothered to read. You'll take it from her or you'll take it from me, but you'll take it because it's true, and you're a man who minds the truth or your badge is a lie." Hewitt minded the truth. It took him a week and a hard ride to the Territorial Land Bureau, and a confrontation with the bribed agent that I wasn't present for and only heard about. But at the end of it, the company's railroad grant paper was declared the forgery it was. The Smoke Hill people's right to the sweetgrass wintering ground was set down in records that could not be burned, and a warrant went out for Augustus Verrill and Dunk Sether on a list of charges as long as my arm. Verrill ran. Men like him always have a horse saddled. Sether did not run. Sether came one last time up the Clearwater Road, and that is the standoff that the story is sometimes told as if it were the whole of it, when it was only the last small piece. He came at dawn with the two riders he had left, the others having decided that the wrong side of a U.S. Marshal was no place to draw wages. He came to the two rivers, because Cal was the man he blamed, and he found the lane to the house blocked not by Cal alone, but by Cal and Tully and a dozen of the Smoke Hill men on their ponies, and the homesteaders the company had bullied all winter, and me with a rifle I was too scared to be much good with. The whole valley Verrill had tried to break apart, standing in one line across one lane. Sether looked at that line a long time. He was a killer, but he was not a fool, and he could count, and he could see the marshal's deputy among us with a warrant in his coat. He sat his horse, and he and Cal looked at each other across 40 feet of cold spring mud, two hard men who'd each tried to kill the other once, and there was a moment where it could have gone any way at all. Cal raised his rifle and fired one shot into the air high, the report rolling off the hills, not at a man, at the morning, a period at the end of a sentence. "It's done, Sether," he said. "The paper's dead. The marshal's behind us. Ride off this valley or ride off it in irons, but you'll ride off it either way, and you'll do it now." And Dunk Sether, who I am sure would have killed every one of us if the Count had favored him, turned his horse in the mud and rode away. And that was the end of the Verrill Land and Cattle Co. in the Sweetgrass, with no man dead and no barn burned, one with ink and nerve and a single shot fired at nothing but the sky. Cal said later he was prouder of that empty shot than of anything he ever did with a loaded one. I believe him. They were married in the early summer, when the grass was belly-deep again, and the world was doing its yearly trick of looking gentle. It was a strange wedding by any standard of that country, held in the bottoms where the cottonwoods broke the wind, with the Smoke Hill people and a fair number of saddle-notch folk who'd come around once the company fell, and Saya's grandmother presiding over the half of it that belonged to her people, and a circuit preacher mumbling through the half that belonged to Cal's, and neither half pretending the other wasn't there. Cal wore a clean shirt and looked like a man who'd been struck by lightning and decided he liked it. Saya wore what her people gave a daughter to wear, and she did not change one thing about herself to stand beside him, and he would not have wanted her to. That was the whole point of the two of them, that neither bent the other into a shape that wasn't theirs. They built a home out of two worlds and made one place of it without throwing either away. I stood up beside my brother, 14 no longer, and when it was done, Saya's grandmother put her hand on my head the way she'd done the night Cal fetched the doctor through the sleet, and said something I didn't understand, and Saya told me later it meant only that I belonged now, which I had not known I'd been waiting all my orphaned life to hear. They had near 40 years. I want to say that plainly too, against all the tellings that end the story at the standoff as if the standoff were the prize. The standoff wasn't the prize. The 40 years were. Cal Dunmore, who had been a stone, learned to laugh again slow, the way everything came to him, but real, and I heard it many times in the decades after, around fires in the bottoms, and at the long table in the ranch house where the two worlds ate together as a matter of course. They raised children who carried both halves of their blood and neither half as a wound. They lost some years to hard winters and some to grief, because no life is spared those, but they lost none of them to the lie that the line the frontier drew was a thing that had to be obeyed. They had decided, the two of them, by a fire one early spring night, that it didn't. Cal went into the ground on the knoll above the Clearwater, beside the first wife and the boy he'd never stopped grieving, because Saya was the one who insisted on it, said his dead were her dead now, and a man should lie with all of his people. She lived 9 years past him and ran the 2 rivers like she gentled that flea-bitten colt, by refusing to fight what didn't need fighting and being immovable about what did. And when she died the whole valley came, the both halves of it, and stood in one line again the way they had across the lane, and I was an old man by then, and I wept like the boy I'd been. I have told this story careful because the careless tellings rob it. They make my brother a man who saved a people, when the truth is a people saved him, pulled him out of the dirt his own kind had left him in, and warmed the stone of him back to a man, and gave him a place to stand that was worth the standing. He spent the rest of his life at their side because he had decided he owed a debt, and he never did stop saying that, but I knew him better than anyone living, and I'll tell you the truth of it now that they're both gone and can't argue with me. It was never the debt that kept him there. It was that for the first time since the fever took everything, somebody had seen him in the dirt and not walked past, and he had found, gray and stubborn and late, that he could do the same. That was the whole of it. A man left for dead by his own, a woman who would not let a life be lost to spite, and 40 years of 2 people standing where they'd chosen to stand, in a green valley that only looked gentle, building something true out of grit and ink, and one shot fired at nothing but the morning sky. That is how it was. I was there. I have spent my life trying to be worthy of it, and I am old now, and I think on the whole I have not done too badly because I learned the one thing they had to teach, the thing the whole hard winter was climbing toward, that the lines other people draw across a country are only lines, and a person gets to decide, every single day, which side of one he means to stand on. Cal decided, so did she, and the deciding was the home,